Monday on October 14th, following the matinee performance, a panel discussion will be held discussing issues highlighted in the play, including economics, family, and individual issues involving serious illness, dying, and mental health. The panelists will be Dr. Rick McIntyre, Director of the Honors Program, Valerie Joseph, a nurse of Clinica Esperanza, and James Wilsey, who's a chaplain at Roger Williams Medical Center. Next week, before we have our feature performance, we'll have an alumni panel moderated by Lieutenant Governor Elizabeth Roberts with Dr. Jolene McFarland, who's a family physician with special interests in women's health and preventative health care. Dr. Keith Lewis, who's also a pharmacist, who's professor and chair of the Department of Anesthesiology at Boston Medical Center. And Marie Gazal, who's the CEO of the Rhode Island Free Clinic with over 30 years of experience in nursing. So we hope that you join us next week for that. But tonight, our feature speaker of the Honors Colloquium, presenting the title of his talk, Vaccines in the 21st Century, Innumeracy, Cognitive Biases, the Power of Story, and Other Survival Lessons. Dr. Gregory Poland is the director of the Mayo Clinic's Vaccine Research Group, a state-of-the-art research group and laboratory. He's professor of medicine and infectious diseases and molecular pharmacology and experimental therapeutics, director of Mayo's Immunization Clinic, Mayo Clinic's program in translational immunovirology and biodefense, and the editor at the journal Vaccine. Dr. Poland's a recipient of a number of honors, including 2 Secretary of Defense honors, the Award for Excellence, and the Medal for Outstanding Public Service. He's also received the Sue Prize in International Infectious Disease Epidemiology and the Charles Merieux Lifetime Achievement Award in Vaccinology. He's a past president of the Defense Health Board. He was appointed as the Mary Lowell Leary Professor of Medicine by Mayo Clinic's Board of Trustees. He's earned his medical degree from the Southern Illinois University School of Medicine and completed his residency and postgraduate work at the University of Minnesota Abbott Northwestern Hospital. A prolific writer, Dr. Poland's published over 350 and counting peer-reviewed scientific articles and book chapter. Please put your hands together for Dr. Greg Poland.
Thank you, Jeff. I've always wanted to come out from behind one of those curtains, so I had to try it. Thank you, Jeff. You didn't say that 15 years ago Jeff was a student in my laboratory, so it's kind of fun to see him do well. None of us thought he would, but I'm kidding. It's interesting, this video clip that you showed about aging reminds me to say that there are many wonderful things about getting older. It's just that we don't know what they are. Very nice to be here in Rhode Island. I've traveled a lot, nationally and internationally, but my first time to be in this state, so I'm very interested to see it. Very interested to see that you're just like us in Minnesota. I didn't expect that. I thought there'd be, some Maine-like accent or something, but I haven't detected it in anybody. At least I don't hear it, and I don't have an accent, so. Okay, we're going to talk about vaccine wars. That's the title that I use because, in a way, and fundamentally, that's what it's become. There are anti-vaccine groups, and let me just say when I talk about this that there is a spectrum from people who just automatically accept vaccines to vehement anti-vaccine people, and then a whole range in between, people who are maybe what we would call vaccine hesitant, who have questions, which are quite legitimate. So we're going to explore some of that. Ogden Nash had an interesting poem, "A mighty creature is the germ, though smaller than a pachyderm. His strange delight he often pleases by giving people strange diseases." Ogden had it right. Well, let me just tell you that one of the things that I'm interested in is, and I'm glad there's some psychologists here too, they'll be interested in this. I'm very interested in how people think and how their thinking leads them to make decisions. And I've noticed that there are different kinds of people. There are a lot of ways to divide people. One is this. At level 1, so people who think just sort of superficially, this is a talk about vaccines and how we make decisions. For those of you that think at the next level, what I'll call level 2, this is a talk about biases and decision-making across academic disciplines. And for those of you who are really discerning, critical thinkers, this talk is about danger. How many of you, by the way, are afraid? Raise your hand if you are afraid. Okay. By the end of the talk, most of you will be afraid. Afraid I won't end? No, I hope it won't be that. But you'll be afraid because what I'm going to do, let me warn you in advance, and I don't mean this in any mean or cruel way. I'm going to warn you in advance that I'm going to take away one of your major illusions. In this case, an illusion you hold about yourself, that you are a coolly rational and objective and competent decision maker. And I'm going to show you that in fundamental, simple, transparent ways, you're wrong. And being wrong means you are in danger because you don't realize you're wrong. All right. Here's the challenge that we face in vaccinology. The vaccine field is dynamic. It is not static. All kinds of things are happening. Revolutionary changes, sometimes false starts, dead ends, new ideas. And the point I make here is that we need new ideas, new people, new paradigms in order to achieve truly transformative change and the better use of vaccines. If we could give everybody every vaccine that we think they should have, we could substantially decrease the epidemics that we experience. I put it this way: we live in an age where we confuse information with knowledge and knowledge with wisdom. A post-science age where every viewpoint is given equal validity and where eminence is equated with evidence. And the point is that there are substantial consequences to that. You don't have to agree with me, just like you don't have to agree with any truth. But the truth is, science is not a democracy. You don't get to just believe what you want to believe. We may have different interpretations of the data, but to ignore the data and make a decision based on your belief often leads to tragic consequences. Okay, for those of you that want to quickly get to sleep, here it is, the summary. This is a war for the arms, noses, and minds of the public. Now, only those of you who understand all the vaccines we give get this one about the nose. It's a little joke, evidently a very little one. For the minds of the public and healthcare workers, and symptomatic of a lot of issues within our society. Anti-vaccinationists, interestingly enough, not only from outside the healing professions, but within the healing professions, have significantly harmed the public health, and I'll demonstrate that. And I think we have to address these issues, and one of the main points I'll make is with new communication styles. Let me just give you a quick tour de force of this. This is measles, the most contagious human disease known. Here's a typical case, March 2010. Unvaccinated child of two highly educated, wealthy parents living in California got infected while traveling to Switzerland. These are people of means. How many of you went to Switzerland this summer? Nobody, okay. The parents had refused the MMR vaccine. Child gets infected over there, comes back and exposed over 900 people, costing the state well over $1 million to control this. U.S. cases in 2011, we had 17 outbreaks with 222 cases across 31 states. 70 ended up being hospitalized, fortunately, and surprisingly, no one died. This is a disease that had been eliminated from the United States, except for what? Large-scale refusal of the MMR vaccine, particularly along the east and west coasts of the United States, based on false evidence propagated by Andrew Wakefield, and I'll show you a little bit of that. So for 2011, we had the highest number of cases that we've had since 1996, and they're coming right now to give you your vaccine. Pertussis, it is now epidemic in California particularly, worst outbreaks than what we've had in the last 60 years. Canada and Australia issued travel warnings to their populace saying delay travel to California, as if it's a third world country. 11% of these 4,000 cases were hospitalized, and at least 12 children have died. For 2012, so far, we've had over 29,000 cases, a twofold increase. Only 8% of adults have been immunized against pertussis in that state. in Washington, the state of Washington, almost 4,300 cases so far. This is the question I taught the students this afternoon. If you learn the question, why, and the second question, how sure are we, you will become a discerning adult. Well, there's some aspects of how we think that I want to give you a little baseline about. And this one is about how we think. And these authors said this: the assumptive world is a broad set of fundamental beliefs, not data, beliefs, that include how we believe people will behave, how events should unfold, how events should unfold, and our ability to influence events. These assumptions give structure to events in an individual's world, allow each individual to plan and predict, and contribute to how people and events in the world are perceived and understood. Do you think that way? Yeah, most of us do think that way. And yet, do you think you really understand how events should unfold in the world? What evidence do you have to suggest that you're any good at that, or that anybody is? Well, this is where you need a pencil and paper. I hope you came to a lecture with a pencil and paper. As I tell my students, if you don't have a pencil and paper, it's tantamount to saying, I've already convinced myself the speaker isn't going to say anything memorable, certainly nothing that I would want to record and remember later. Don't make that mistake. If you do that, you will become a less intelligent person. If you become a less intelligent person, you will have less intelligent children. If you have sounds like that dish commercial, doesn't it? All right, what do you see there? How many of you see a black triangle, a white triangle, and 3 little Pac-Man things? And in this talk, you have to raise your hand high, and you should feel free to look around, okay? How many of you see that? Okay, that's the only thing that's not there. There are 3 Pac-Man things there, but there are, in fact, no triangles. There are angles, but there are no triangles there. I'm telling you, there is not a triangle there. Try to turn the illusion off. All right, here's what you did. You ignored my instructions, which was to say what was there. You used reflexive, or what Daniel Kahneman would call System 1 type thinking, to make sense out of complexity. And you did it in a manner that was cognitively easy for you, what's been called the law of least effort. You failed to activate slower expert, or what he would call System 2 thinking. Even now, as I said, aware of the error, you can't turn the illusion off. And if I can do this with something simple and visual, do you think that the advertisers are doing this to you? Do you think that in any field, let's just take vaccines, that there are visual illusions like this that evoke emotion, where there's complexity and you use the law of least effort to make sense of that complexity and come up with the wrong answer, as 90% or so of you just did? Well, psychology suggests that we use perceptual organization to create meaning out of stimuli, and that's generally a good thing. Our brain makes sense of shapes and symbols, putting them together like a jigsaw puzzle. But notice this: formulating that which isn't there to that which is believable. Point is this: we do it with decision-making in all domains, but tonight we're talking about vaccines. Well, G.K. Chesterton said, with every step of our lives, we enter right into the middle of some story which we're certain to misunderstand. Tonight we're going to explore that story. Have you had enough coffee? Can you see the illusion? Got to pay attention. Put your seatbelts on. We're going to talk about the nature of beliefs, narratives, cultural frames, and cognitive biases. Here's the reality. There is a complex, and in vaccinology and public health this gets ignored, interplay between vaccine use and decision-making, cognitive linguistics and how we frame things, human behavior and perceptions and decision-making. This connection between human behaviors and frames or beliefs or perceptions in regards to risk profoundly influences thinking and vaccine use. In fact, it predicts the decision that you're going to make. You think you're an independent decision maker. I'm going to show you repeatedly tonight you're not. I already know the decisions you're going to make. And I haven't even asked you the question yet. So for the first time on this state, all right, here's one cultural frame I want to talk about with you tonight. Vaccines in the public health, and you might never have thought of it this way, are fundamentally about moral values. Let me illustrate. Getting disease X is a bad thing. We attach a moral word to it. Preventing a disease is a good thing. Again, another moral word or frame attached to it. Moral values are articulated as words, and words are defined relative to a frame or belief. So we think and we make decisions in terms of systems of these frames or beliefs assembled into concepts that we think make sense and are moral. The problem is this, what's been called the cognitive unconscious, the system of concepts that structure our brains and thinking and which can mislead us. And most of the time, we're totally unaware of. Well, people make decisions. Vaccines, one of them. I would like, since I'm imagining that unfortunately few of you are vaccinologists, think about your own area of expertise or of interest and apply what I'm talking about vaccines to your area. People make decisions in a variety of ways, heuristics or just rules of thumb. They use emotion. A very few number of people actually use data to make decisions. And as you might think through, how you make decisions, especially about your health, has major ramifications for outcome. All right, what is this? This is a banana. How do you open this? What most of you do is you grab it here and you try to open it there. And since there are no bananas really grown in the U.S., they're picked green and shipped here. As a result, they come to us usually pretty green. And so what you do is you dig your thumb into this area here, trying to open the banana. It often doesn't work, and so then you use a knife. When you use a knife, at least at Mayo Clinic, about 20 times a year, somebody comes in and has sliced open the web between their first and second digits. Okay? Why do they do this? The common experience fallacy. This is how you open a banana. I never knew this until a year and a half ago when I was a visiting professor down doing some mission work in Ecuador. And I'm sitting, here I am, Herr Professor, and all my colleagues are sitting around, we're having breakfast, I grab a banana, open it the only way I know to, and they burst out laughing. I mean, I can't duplicate the Spanish accent, but I said, what's so funny? They said, Dr. Poland, even a monkey knows how to open a banana. And it's true, if you go on YouTube, this is how a monkey opens a banana. How come we don't know this? We never saw anybody open a banana this way, and it never entered our mind that there was another way to open a banana. Now, some of you don't want to hear this. I know that doesn't make it any less true. All right. Now, what I want you to do is draw exactly what you're about to see. I'm going to show this slide for about 3 seconds, especially you over here. Pencils and paper, please. I'm going to show you for about 3 seconds a slide. What I want you to do is look at the slide and then draw exactly what's on that slide onto the paper, okay? If I haven't said it very clearly, draw precisely what's on the slide. Exactly what you see on the slide, draw it on your piece of paper. Are you ready? Here we go. Okay. How many of you saw a slide with a white background, a black outline of a diamond, and written in the center is the phrase, Paris in the spring? Raise your hands, nice and high. Look around. Okay? Well, that's not what was on the slide. Okay? This is what was on the slide. Okay? Now, by my count, I stopped my talk, gave you precise instructions 4 times. You're already suspicious of me because I warned you I'm going to show you simple, transparent examples and that you would get them wrong. I've already shown that to you, illustrated and demonstrated that to you. You're all well fed. I hope you got enough sleep. Nobody suffered any major trauma last night. You're all intelligent people. Interestingly enough, when I showed this same slide at Brown, they all got it. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. All right. What could have happened? How did 80% of these intelligent people in the room get this wrong? Well, this is the availability and coherence bias. Who ever heard of Paris in the spring? But you have ears to hear and eyes to see. There was nothing that you missed. It was written in a language you understand. You saw it, but yet were blind to the data. Do you see the point? How often must this happen in our lives? This is simple. Take something like the complexity of decision-making about your health. How often are you making decisions based on what you see or perceive rather than what's really there? This was reflexive thinking. It immediately kicked in and made decisions for you, and you didn't even counter that reflexive thinking. And the point is, most of us are lazy decision makers. We fail to activate the more expert systems and answer the question you were instructed to. Draw exactly what's there. You made a simple and fundamental mistake in decision making despite warnings. All right, maybe you're more mathematical. You've got exactly $1.10 to spend. You have to spend it all. You have to buy one bat, one ball. The bat has to cost exactly $1 more than the ball. So how much must the ball cost? How many of you say 1 cent? I'm going to look around. Everybody has to vote. How many of you say 1 cent? Raise your hand high. Okay, how many say 5 cents? How many say 10 cents? Look around and see how many people. Raise your hand, those of you that said 10 cents. How many people say 20 cents? The answer is what? It's 5 cents. It's the only thing it can be. What happened? This is 5th-ish grade-ish math. Okay? And the 70-ish% of you that said it has to be 10 cents. How did you come up with that answer? Reflex. I said $1.10. You got to buy 2 things. It has to cost $1 more. Okay, that leaves 10 cents. And you never actually did the hard work. You never spent the ATP to say, well, wait a minute. If it has to cost $1 more than the ball, the only thing the ball can cost is 5 cents. This is the law of least effort. Again, you failed to check reflexive thinking. This misled you into overconfidence in your intuitive and to you seemingly coherent response to the problem. You made a simple and fundamental mistake in decision making that predetermined you would make this error. Well, in part, this is called innumeracy. This is not a very nice word. It's like calling somebody illiterate. It's the mathematical equivalent. These are individuals who are just wired such that probability and statistics and calculus don't make any sense. So they are then, if you will, mathematically illiterate. So they cannot wrestle with and make decisions about probability. This is important because in science and in medicine, we are socialized to be highly analytical. Okay? So if you go and get a vaccine, we hand you what's called a VIS, a Vaccine Information Statement. It's full of probability and statistics because that's how we think. Must be that the whole world thinks that way. But most of you don't think that way. And we never get it. And so we don't educate you very well about this. Now, there is no known genotype, at least to date, for an enumerate, but there is a verbal phenotype. When you hear somebody say this, I don't care what the data say, I believe, that's an enumerate. Run. I'm just afraid that I'll get Guillain-Barré syndrome because they heard of a case. It's too risky. What if X happens? Or this one. How do we know it's safe to get the flu vaccine every year? I was asked that publicly by somebody at the CDC. And it was the first time I was stunned into silence. And I finally stammered out the answer to the question. Well, because we have 6 decades of data. That's how we know. He was an enumerate. He could not wrestle with those concepts of probability. Well, if you happen to be enumerate, here's a primer for you. Temporality is not causality. Correlation is not causality. Just because 2 things happen close in time doesn't mean that one caused the other. But that is a powerful thing in people's thinking, in their intuitive thinking. They have a strong tendency to personalize. You're saying this could happen 1 in a million? I'm the 1 in a million. Okay, maybe that's narcissism, I don't know. They dramatically underestimate the frequency of coincidences. This happens all the time in cancer clusters, for example. They are coincidences. They believe that the plural of anecdote is data. They value this anecdote over facts. I've sat there and counseled people in my office. This person's got diabetes and congestive heart failure, and they're a smoker and have lung disease, and I'm telling them to get a flu shot. And they say, well, doctor, you say that, but my neighbor's aunt says, how do you respond? I said, oh, is she in medicine? No, she's a homemaker. Well, what do you say to that? You know you're dealing with somebody at a different level than a highly analytic mindset. They cannot understand or manipulate concepts of probability and risk. All right, here's another one. This is a chance for redemption. Okay? Steve is a healthy man in his mid-40s. He lives here in Providence, Rhode Island. It's amazing. Anyway, he's described as a quiet, meek, and tidy soul. He has a need for order and structure and a passion for detail. He enjoys reading and indoor activities. How many people say Steve is a car salesman? Raise your hand. How many people say Steve is a farmer? Raise your hand. How many people say Steve is a librarian? Raise your hand. How many people say Steve is a physician? Raise your hand. What is Steve? Steve is a physician. How do I know? Why is that the only rational thing we can guess here? All right, let me try it this way. How many car salesmen are there in Providence, Rhode Island? 75, 100, I don't know. How many farmers are there? A couple hundred? How many librarians are there? 50? How many physicians are there? 1,000? Something like that? You failed to take account of the base rate. The only information I gave you is that this man calls himself Steve. He identifies himself as a male. He lives here, and he's in his mid-40s. The rest is gibberish. What I did do, and predetermined you would make the error, is the representativeness heuristic. Reflex thinking told you this fit your stereotype of a librarian. I actually know a number of librarians because I love books. None of them fit that stereotype, by the way, that I know. You decided to solve the problem you could do rather than the one I asked you to do. And you failed to account for, well, you really haven't given me any information here. The only thing I can fall back on is how many of each of these professions are there in Providence? And that's the likely answer. This misled you into overconfidence in your intuitive response to the problem. Made a simple and fundamental mistake in decision making. My point is, with these simple examples, that if in these easy kind of junior high school level things, if sophisticated people make errors in looking at the data and coming up with the right response, how much harder in decisions about, should I get a vaccine? Should I buy life insurance? Should I buy long-term care insurance? Should I invest in the market? Or what kind of car should I buy? Any of the many decisions that you have to make. How should I vote? We can talk about that later. Well, what have we learned so far? Almost all of us failed these simple, straightforward questions. We have biases that direct our thinking and therefore our choices. And here's the key thing I want you to remember. Without us really even realizing it, we fail to even see, much less accept, the data we do need to make good decisions. I'm telling you, now that I've shown this to you, you're going to see it all the time. The media, celebrities, politicians, they know this, and they use this to their advantage. I'm telling you, opening a pack of Camels and smoking is not going to make you cool. It's not going to have a bunch of friends laughing, dressed to the T's. It doesn't work that way. But do you think that they're stupid and they don't think that by portraying it that way, they're not going to influence you to smoke? The most popular and recognizable icon among junior high school students is Joe Camel. They know. Well, let's apply it to vaccines. Now, who would have ever guessed that a paper published in The Lancet, don't you know, ileolymphoid nodular hyperplasia, nonspecific colitis, and pervasive developmental disorder, read autism, in children. Who would have thought that that would have caught attention? Andrew Wakefield and others published this paper. You see their names there. And this has led to the largest anti-vaccine movement we've seen in modern times. Millions of people refusing or afraid of MMR vaccine based on data that has now, by every council that's looked at it, been judged dishonest, misleading, and serious professional misconduct and stripped him of his medical license. In fact, they said that he acted dishonestly and irresponsibly with callous disregard for the children in his study. And yet, this is a pervasive belief. He had only to publish that one paper in a medical journal none of you read, probably, and yet you know the story. Isn't that interesting? Well, this was latched upon by scientific luminaries like Jenny McCarthy and Jim Carrey. Okay? They're not actually married. This is her son. And they're wearing shirts that say, "Green are vaccines." What does that mean? Make them green? Do you want to get a green vaccine injected in? What does that even mean? I mean, it's illogical, is what it is. Well, she says your children shouldn't be immunized. Her credentials are that she's a Playboy bunny. Her credentials are, 20 some odd years of hard schooling. Who do you trust? How are you going to make your decision? I'm telling you, a lot of people made this decision over there. And some of them, their children died, or were hospitalized, or are permanently disabled. And I can tell you from having done it, it is tragic to counsel them, because there's no going back ever. You can never change your mind after that happens and say, how did I make such a stupid decision? Because Larry King or Oprah or Jenny McCarthy said it's dangerous? Well, this is the kind of thing that they do. The black line is the number of cases of autism over time. And they said that the red line was the number of vaccines that children are getting. And look, it's a very tight correlation. As we give more vaccines, the incidence of autism went up. It must be true. Correlation is causality, right? Well, I pointed out to them, this is also the increase in the number of cell phones, the number of new McDonald's, the suburban deer population, the number of Facebook members. Now the curve doesn't work because that went way up. And the number of times politicians tell us they stand for hope and change. Are those causative of autism? Not that I know of. And neither are vaccines. Well, part of this is what Michael Spector, a health writer for the New York Times, published this book called Denialism, How Irrational Thinking Hinders Scientific Progress and Decision-Making Threatens Our Lives. You can bring the data. You can show the now 23 or 24 studies across 2 decades and multiple continents, hallmark of science is generalizability and repeatability, all showing the same thing. There is no correlation. And yet, the lie's been told, and people believe it. I don't know if you know the story of Desiree Jennings. This is an interesting one. Desiree her credentials in science are that she's a Washington Redskins cheerleader. And she got flu vaccine, and she could no longer walk. She walks like this, but she can walk backwards fine. There actually is, in neurology, what's called dystonia that's like that. But Desiree did something that a lot of narcissists do. She posted it on YouTube, unfortunately for her, because neurologists the world over, including the Mayo Clinic, looked at it and said, this is hysteria. This is not a medical condition. Reported it that way. Look at the moral frame. Vaccine what? Victim viciously attacked by the medical establishment. Medical establishment is a way of inducing what thought in your mind? Conspiracy, right? They framed it using moral frames that lead people into making a decision. They have not seen any of the data, but you're already told what to believe. Now, what's interesting to me is that Jenny McCarthy and Jim Carrey were so touched by Desiree's story that they donated money to help her and to start a foundation. But, and who is Desiree? As I said, she's a 26-year-old cheerleader. I'm not going to play the clips, but here is her trying to walk. And it's a miracle, folks. She was cured after urine detoxification and chelation therapy. Okay? Something that has no scientific basis whatsoever. But this is interesting. Fox News said, well, wait a minute, all these doctors are saying this isn't real. So they went and filmed Desiree when she didn't know they were watching. And she could walk quite normally, thank you. When confronted with this, she said, it's a miracle. I'm cured. But she said this. She claims the vaccine is causing her to speak with a British or Australian accent. She couldn't distinguish the two. Now, you're laughing at this, and I'm kind of presenting it that way. But the point is this. How many hundreds of thousands of people did this level of ignorance influence into not getting the pandemic influenza vaccine? Albert Einstein said only two things are certain, the universe and human stupidity, and I'm not certain about the universe. And he was a very bright man. Okay? All right, some more thoughts about cultural trends. Remind you of George Santayana's quote from 1923, those who fail to learn the histories, the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. What are the lessons of history? This was a famous woodcut. I'm looking around for the medical historian that I saw there, about Jenner's work with smallpox vaccine. You laugh now, but people actually thought if they got vaccine, pieces of cow would grow out of where they got the vaccine. That seems laughable to you. No more laughable than MMR vaccine causing autism to me. It's equally ignorant. I wrote an article in the New England Journal, when was that, a year ago, I guess, called The Age-Old Struggle Against the Anti-Vaccinationist, and said that this seems to be kind of encoded into our DNA. Every time we come up with a new vaccine, there is an anti-vaccine group that forms against it. It's not natural is one of them. That's always happened. And so I've wondered, and the reason that I'm interested in behavioral psychology in this regard is, what's the tipping point? What makes somebody pro-vaccine? What makes them afraid of vaccines? Well, this is what we've called the vaccine wars. So here's the cultural trend that has occurred. Not trying to be sexist here, other than just the observation that it's almost always mom that brings the kids in for vaccines. Okay? Maybe dads are squeamish or something. In the 1950s, a good mother got her kids immunized. And that is the picture she had in her mind. I was born in the middle of the last century, And I vaguely remember, I grew up in Virginia, my mom wouldn't let us go to the public swimming pool, which is where we wanted to go in Virginia during the summer, because in her mind, that's where kids got polio. We didn't understand at the time. We just thought we had a mean mom. And in the year of my birth, the headlines in the New York Times was nothing about my birth, but Salk polio vaccine had been invented. There's never been a vaccine since that has made the headlines of the New York Times. That's how much things have changed. And now instead, starting about the 1980s, a good mother does her research. Maybe kids don't need all these vaccines after all. And where does mom turn to do her research? To the internet. Without regard to the legitimacy or credibility of the information on the internet. All right. And then there are different kinds of healthcare providers. In fact, this lady actually was a former pharmaceutical clinical research consultant who is now going to tell all the dirty secrets. This appeals to people who have low complexity styles of cognition, okay, who believe in conspiracies everywhere, okay? She's appealing to that mindset. Well, there are over 300,000 anti-vaccine internet sites. Some of them have very winsome names. They actually look official, the National Vaccine Information Center. And there are a little over 53 million anti-vaccine group entries that I could find on Google currently. And I picked 9292 because that's when I first signed into the internet. There were none then. Almost 54 million now. So when mom does her research, guess what she finds on the internet? And yet, there was an era of exception. People lined up for miles when the polio vaccine became available. This is the year 2000 when there was an influenza vaccine shortage. And old people who are particularly at risk for influenza lined up, and if I could use this term with people this age, rioted to get the vaccine. So when they perceive danger, whether or not it's present, when they perceive danger, they demand the vaccine. When they don't perceive danger, they perceive fear of the vaccine. Well, it turns out, as best I can find, I'm interested if you have any reasons. I so far can find no exceptions to this. People get vaccines for 3 reasons: fear, bandwagoning, or because they're required or coerced into doing it. Bandwagoning is really just social pressure. If the people around you aren't getting it, and your pastor from the pulpit says get it, and your doctor says, and all the people that you respect around you says get it, you'll almost inevitably get it. They say don't get it, or they're fearful, you probably won't get the vaccine. One of the cartoonists heard me talking about this, and he said, you know, what we have is a flu vaccine. What we need is a vaccine against fear. And everybody's a comic. He says Dr. Poland sticks by his findings. Anyway, so this one exception, let me go to the next slide, was from about the 1940s to somewhere in the early 80s. And I can discern the collusion of 3 important trends. This is the post-World War II baby boom now, okay? There was a science boom. Many of the major vaccines discovered in this era. There was a clear and present danger. Parents saw epidemic disease. They don't see it now for the most part. And as I said, the baby boom. Those 3 factors together, they were anxious to get the vaccines that were available. But we don't do very well now, and my hypothesis is this is a communication mistake on our part, on healthcare providers' part. We use the language of reason and consciousness and ignore the issues of reality perception and reality construction. Even though the data are clear, and as I demonstrated with you, humans make decisions not by reason, but by emotional projection and cognitive frames that together form stories and parables, we're going to come back to those terms, that dictate their decisions, unknown to them and surprisingly uninformed. I say this because I'm sitting, my daughter's a master's level psychologist. We're sitting there talking at the dinner table, as we often do, and I imagine you do, about vaccines. And she said, you know, Dad, this is interesting. For 26 years I've heard you talk about this. And she says, I just got to tell you that, you know, in my world, in the world of psychology, the way that you talk about and educate about vaccines is not data-driven. You're ignoring what we know about human behavior. And the light bulb went on for me. My daughter taught me something. I wouldn't say that if she were here, but I'm telling you this. And there's a number of books that have picked up on this, and I commend these books to you. Daniel Pink talking about why right-brainers will rule the future and drive the surprising truth about what motivates it. Some of this gets into sort of pop psychology, but he's on to something, and he's trying to make available and accessible to the lay public some fairly sophisticated concepts. One of the things he talks about is if we want to motivate people to go in a different direction, there are reasons they're motivated. He calls them the 6 senses. So one of them is design, from a functional product to emotionally engaging. I'm telling you, it makes the hair stand up on my neck to talk about a new vaccine. Well, not my neck, but maybe yours. You're not interested in a new peptide-based smallpox vaccine that I'm working on, but you might be engaged if I can emotionally engage you about the terrorism risk of smallpox and what it might mean. Or story, from simple facts and statistics that I give you to a compelling narrative or meta-narrative for your life. From analysis to synthesis and on and on. So have we used those in the health professions? I can tell you as physicians, we're not taught anything about this style of communication. Well, how might this actually work out in this sort of a little bit simplistic, but right brain, left brain sort of thinking? Healthcare workers, we're all about figures and numbers. Your risk of this is X, and so therefore you should get this vaccine. The risk of the vaccine is only 1 in a million. Therefore, there's much more benefit than risk. Well, the patient might be much more interested in figurative language and not probability, but possibilities. Not facts, but maybe they'd make decisions better with pictures. We see things often in black and white. You should do this, like there's no alternative. And they see ambiguity. We have argument. They see story. And so might we use this in the way that we talk about and educate about vaccines? Well, as I pointed out, physicians and scientists tend to be left-brain thinkers. They're not exempt from innumeracy, and they generally have not had a significant or positive impact on these debates, or wars as I call them. And to some degree, I would say pediatricians, as a group and individually, have done better than internists. I'm an internist. I see adults. Than we have. And we seem not to be able to change this state of affairs. Immunization rates in the population have sort of hit a ceiling, and we don't make much progress. Despite, let's take flu vaccine, we have 6 decades worth of data now. What more do we need? Mark Turner has written about cognitive linguistics, and he wrote a book called The Literary Mind. Again, it's a well-written book, kind of a dense book, but I commend it to you. And he talks about this notion of story and projection and parable. And he says story is a basic organizing principle of the mind. The mental scope of a story is magnified by projecting it, one story on top of another. And the projection of this one story after another is called parable. Have you heard that word parable before? What does it bring to mind? The Bible. Now, very interesting, in an illiterate culture, trying to teach what were, sort of sophisticated concepts. The way that the teaching occurred was through story, or, if you will, parable. And he calls parable the root of the human mind, of thinking, knowing, acting, creating, and of speaking. So how might this play out? Well, despite massive education programs, knowledge, and access to vaccine, surprisingly few people received the pandemic 2009-2010 vaccine. They ignored the risk of the pandemic and operated based on fears of the vaccine. Same question I taught you to ask earlier today. Why? Why did that state of affairs happen? Well, here's one possibility. Here's the story. Injecting a foreign substance into you is dangerous. Here's the projection. I remember Guillain-Barré syndrome happened to some people who got the 1976 H1N1 vaccine. The parable, so this new vaccine is a new substance and it must be dangerous. I better not get it. New vaccines are dangerous and something bad could happen to me. You see how it happens? Do you see how the parable occurs? Do you see how, almost unbeknownst to the decision maker, they come to this conclusion? Well, Michael Shermer is a psychologist who wrote a book called The Believing Brain. It's a great book, and it encompasses much more than science. But it's an interesting book to read about this. And he has a concept, I don't know if it's unique to him or whether it's a more generalized concept, called belief-dependent realism. Hear me closely here, because I think this ends up being something that determines important aspects of all of our lives. He says we form our beliefs for a variety of subjective, personal, emotional, and psychological reasons in a context. The context is environments created by family, friends, colleagues, culture, society, blah, blah, blah. After forming our beliefs, we then defend, justify, and rationalize them with a host of arguments that seem cogent to us. His point is this: beliefs come first, explanations for the beliefs follow. You see this played out in the presidential debates and how people vote, right? It's belief-dependent realism, and it happens to you and I. All right, another example. I want you to write down in words what you are about to see. So if you see the number 2, write TWO. If you're an orthopedic surgeon, not TOO, but TW. That's, again, a little joke. All right, are you ready? Write down in words what you're about to see. Okay, how many of you see across the top ABC? Raise your hands. There are people who don't see ABC? Raise your hands if you see ABC. Okay, and on the bottom, 12, 13, 14. Amazing. This always works. These are the same. This could be a B, that could be a 13. So why do you see it that way? I didn't separate them. You see ABC and you saw 12, 13, 14. You couldn't be more suspicious of me at this point in the lecture. You know I'm going to pull something like this. I've warned you. And yet, there's the point I'm making. So system 1, fast, reflexive thinking. It's ABC 12, 13, 14. Stop. And you never let expert thinking take over and say, well, wait a minute. This and this are no different. This could be A 13, 12, B 14. What happened here? This is neglect of ambiguity and suppression of doubt. You did it without even thinking about it and made a decision. You didn't even falter. Your hands went right up. If this is true, it's completely counter to how we envision ourselves. And so I ask you the question, you all see, but are you blind? How might this reality explain how patients think about and decide about vaccines or other medical interventions? Could this be true at the group level? Do groups make decisions this way? I wouldn't ask the question if it wasn't yes. And as I said, perhaps we're not really the coolly rational decision makers we thought we were about 45 minutes ago. Well, the point I'm trying to make is this. If these writers, and I've shown you now writers from across multiple disciplines, are right, then I think we in the healthcare field have made a fundamental mistake and overlooked the obvious and failed in our primary duty, which is to persuade patients to take action for themselves, and not only for themselves, but for the good of the community. When I get a vaccine and I don't get exposed to a disease and I'm not infected, then I don't expose you or your child either. But there are truths here. I don't want you to think, well, he's irrationally exuberant about vaccines. There is no man-made product. There is no man-made product that is 100% safe. That includes vaccines. There's no vaccine that's 100% effective. And it's impossible to prove absolute safety. It cannot be done. And therein lies the dilemma for people whose mode of thinking is fear-based. I can never prove to you with certainty that something is absolutely safe because you can't study enough people. If I study, what are there, I don't know anymore, 6 billion people on the planet? Then you say, well, could it happen 1 in 7 billion times? And I could never answer that question for you. Here are the risks. Your chance of dying, if you're choking, is 1 in 68,000. Of dying in a bike crash, 1 in 96,000. Drowning, 1 in 20,000 people. Car crash, 1 in 5,000. You get into a car almost every day, not realizing your risk of death is 1 in 5,000. Your risk of permanent disability is about 20%. Lightning, 1 in 2 million. Influenza, 1 in 8,000. Measles, 1 to 3 people out of every 1,000. Tetanus, 1 in 2. The most serious adverse reaction to a vaccine, as best we can estimate, because we can't even measure it, is that it's no higher than 1 in a million. If you're a rational person, which risk are you going to take? Given that there is no escaping risk. I've heard it said this way: there is no decision where hard doesn't exist. There's no option here. Not making a decision is a risky decision. So it's all about risk and benefit and that balance therein. It's been said acting in one's own self-interest does not always best serve one's self-interest if you're a fear-based thinker. Well, remember, temporality does not imply causality. Let me show you an example. Over the 6-month time period that we gave the pandemic H1N1 vaccine during the first year of the pandemic, thousands of people suffered acute heart attack, stroke, death, new onset MS, spontaneous abortion, etc. By chance alone, when you're giving millions of doses of vaccine, a number of those events will occur within minutes, days, weeks of getting the vaccine. But it doesn't mean the vaccine caused that side effect. Now, recognizing this, one of my colleagues wrote this paper, and he said, let's look at the background rates of things that happen to people. So, in the absence of any vaccine, what happens to people within 1 day, within 7 days, within 6 weeks? Okay? So by chance alone, at time 0 when you get a vaccine, your risk of GBS per 10 million vaccines is about 0.5 within 1 day, 4 within a week, and 22 people within 6 weeks. By the way, that's the window we use to say vaccine caused something. Now, the people who had this side effect, what do you think they believe? What do you think their families believe? Do you think there's any data, any discussion that will dissuade them of temporality and causality? How about spontaneous abortion? Within 6 weeks, almost 17,000 women per million will spontaneously abort their baby. Now, if they got the vaccine, what do you think they're going to blame? But it is powerful in the human mind, this temporality and causality. And even scientists fall prey to this. Well, some other issues related to how we make decisions. I talked about the two languages, if you will, of left brain versus right brain. The failure to understand this narrative of story and parable and how all of us make decisions. This low cognitive complexity thinking, particularly vis-a-vis the conspiracy theory. Innumeracy and denialism. And then there are people with personal agendas. There are people who, the way I first got exposed to this in my training is I was a medical student and a baby had died of sudden infant death syndrome. And these things keep happening and we keep learning tragically how wrong they are. But at the time there was the theory that pertussis vaccine, the whooping cough vaccine, caused SIDS. And this mother believed that. And the resident said, Dr. Poland, This will be a great learning experience for you. Go in and counsel that mom. I can tell you that was traumatic. I still have nightmares about that, trying to counsel this mom that this was not due to the vaccine, when everything in her wanted to believe that this was due to the vaccine. Well, my daughter and I got to talking more and more about this, and you've heard of autism spectrum disorder. We invented a little play on words that we called vaccine education spectrum disorder. The importance of incorporating psychological and cognitive models into vaccine education. And my daughter Caroline has been developing this idea of preferred cognitive styles. And we've tried to sort of simplistically here outline what some of those are. So, for example, there are denialists. There are people whose cognitive style is to simply deny the data when it doesn't fit with their belief. So how might they express that? I don't care what the data show. I don't believe the vaccine is safe. So approaching them with the data, no matter how many mounds of data I have, are never going to persuade them to take action to protect themselves. So how might we handle that? Similarly for innumerates or fear-based individuals or bandwagoning people. And then the people dear to my heart, the analytics. Okay? I love the analytics because we can have a discussion. They come in armed with the data and they want to debate it, and we can come to resolution about it. Well, the desired state is a knowledgeable and educated providers and populace with a compelling story and parable leading to nearly universal vaccine coverage and the eradication and control of vaccine-preventable diseases. I'm going to summarize in just a few slides here by saying ample data demonstrate, and we demonstrated it tonight, that we fundamentally make flawed decisions due to biases we're not even aware of. We operate on a belief-dependent realism model, and therefore the data that we do bring to bear doesn't change our minds. We make systematic errors in judgment and choice. We'd be wise to understand that in our life, in this case applied to vaccines, and you also learn that there's a better way to peel a banana. There are some antidotes to this faulty decision-making. Believe that, yes, even you make faulty decisions and you make predictable errors. And for the most part, as I pointed out, you're blind to these errors. Replace impression by computation. Be wary of celebrity experts and the quality of their opinions. Frankly, I think it's irrelevant what Larry King thinks or Oprah thinks about vaccines. They have no knowledge. Slow down. Let expert thinking kick in. Overcome the reflexive thinking that I demonstrated to you tonight, and allow time to deliberate. Error, myth, superstition cloud our ability to see the data, Thomas Kuhn wrote in his famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And this, I think, he said it really well. I like words and how we assemble words. He said, we believe scientific process is a process of linear accretion of knowledge. And that's simply not true. Sometimes there are fantastic leaps. Nobody believes Stanley Prusner that a protein, a misfolded protein, we now call them prions, could actually replicate and cause disease. They laughed at him because this was paradigm busting. Nobody had heard of something like this. When it was shown that gastric ulcers were an infectious disease, not something due to stress and gastric acid, people didn't believe it. They refused to use antibiotic treatment. Marshall had to swallow a culture of the bacteria and prove that it caused gastritis. Believability is predicated on the belief that we understand what the world is like. And we suppress what we think of as fundamental novelties because they're seen as subversive to our firmly held beliefs of what the world is like. Well, they tyrannized Galileo into recanting the fruits of his scientific genius, handed Socrates a cup of hemlock, put a match to Joan of Arc, and fomented the crucifixion of Christ. As I heard it said, maybe a funnier way, is the experts built the Titanic and novices built the Ark. Be wary of experts. There is no other or better way I know of than the Western scientific method. It is well defined. It starts with observation, generation of hypotheses, design of experiments to generate high-quality data that allow us to accept or reject those hypotheses, agnostic and ideally rigorous peer review, repeatability and generalizability of those results. And the point is that's a slow, deliberate process. What does the press do that makes you suspicious of science? They report every incremental finding, no matter how faulty. Eggs are good for you. Eggs are bad for you. Radon's a risk. No, it's not unless you're a smoker. And it goes on and on. It's because you're hearing little pieces of the data and you're assembling those pieces, those frames, into a story. And you're making faulty decisions based on that. And so you have to come up with signs. Caution, this sign has sharp edges. Do not touch the edges of this sign. You have to be that concrete sometimes with people. All right, I'm going to leave you with 2 rules for success. Okay? You might want to write them down. Rule number 1, never tell everything you know. Thank you. You hung in with me here. And I think we're going to have some Q&A. I will go as long as you want to go with Q&A. And I would love to have some questions that challenge what I've said or perhaps experiences that you've had. Okay, here's one. Dr. Poland, what happened to your hair? It's the anti-vaccination. Now, what can be done at a national level to change the behavior of those individuals who refuse or resist vaccinations? Well, that's an interesting question, and we've done some experiments. One of them is, in the U.S., you can't go to public school without getting certain vaccines. Some states, and it's different in all states, allow certain exemptions. The state of California just passed a rule saying you must have vaccines. And if you don't want to get vaccines, you must go and be counseled by a healthcare provider. And then and only then can you sign an informed declination. This is such an issue with influenza and healthcare workers that we are having to mandate it. We have ample stories and data of nurses and doctors and other healthcare workers spreading influenza to the vulnerable hospitalized patients they care for, leading to their deaths. And yet, particularly nurses are afraid of the vaccine. Your own state is getting ready to vote on a law that will require healthcare workers to get flu vaccine. So I think there's some things like that we can do. But as I was saying to one of the psychologists here, I really think we almost have to go back in time. I think what we need to do in education is start at grade school and junior high and teach people how to think. If you can reach them before they form beliefs, because after they form beliefs, for the most part, what the data say is they are resistant to the data. Teach them how to think, how to make decisions, how to be discerning and critical decision makers. I think that's the real long-term answer to that question. Is there another one?
There is. The state of Rhode Island has mandated, it'll appear, that employees in contact with patients must be vaccinated against influenza or wear a mask.
Yes.
Comment, please.
That's what the law will read in
Regulations,
the state.
yes.
Bravo. Okay. Comment on that. Well, a little over a decade ago, I introduced a resolution at CDC trying to get their support to mandate it. So I'm the cause of this. We've had every infection control, every primary care professional society, every infectious disease society, every hospital epidemiology society endorse the mandates for healthcare workers to get flu vaccine. Why don't they get it? Fear. I've talked to tens of thousands of healthcare workers, and the primary reason they don't get it is fear. And it doesn't matter what the data show. They've made a fear-based decision, and there is no overcoming that. And you finally just have to say, if you want the privilege of taking care of patients, Your duty is to protect that patient against diseases that you could spread or transmit to them. And that's why I've been pushing that.
How much do you think is Big Pharma responsible for the suspicion people may feel about vaccines being a good health choice?
Yeah, this is kind of the conspiracy kind of thing. And the problem is that institutions sometimes give us reason to believe that, right? Big Pharma and what was it, GSK was just recently fined something like $1 billion or something for the way that they marketed not vaccines but other drugs. So they're sometimes their own enemy. I have not seen that on the vaccine side. Maybe I'm blind to it, but I'm sitting at the decision-making table at the national level, and I have not seen that. In fact, what I've seen is the system work. When Merck came up with the first rotavirus vaccine and the first signal of what's called intussusception, where the intestine telescopes on itself in infants, they immediately withdrew the vaccine. That's what I've seen. I haven't seen evidence of, I'm sure there probably are small instances of bad behavior somewhere, but I have not seen this at a big pharma level. I just haven't.
Dr. Poland, what is your opinion on the hygiene hypothesis? Does natural immunity have a benefit on children to an extent?
So the question about hygiene hypothesis, to put it simply, for those of you that might not have heard about it, it'll show up there, okay. It's the idea that like the French believe, that we should live closer to the dirt, to the earth, because it benefits us. And indeed, there is circumstantial evidence that shows, for example, that farm kids have less in the way of asthma. And we are beginning to learn that there's this concept, and marketers are taking advantage of this. You should have Clorox wipes and wipe down everything around you. You should have hand gel and use hand gel constantly. You shouldn't touch anything. And that's just wrong. It turns out, and we were talking about this a while ago, you are a bioscaffolding for bacteria and viruses. If I could dip you into a tank and extract DNA, most of the DNA is not yours. It's bugs and parasites. And you need them. It's called the microbiome. In fact, what we're beginning to learn is that it shapes our immune responses, usually in favorable ways. Let me give you one interesting and perhaps grotesque example. When we put people on antibiotics, they can develop a problem with a bacteria called Clostridium difficile, okay? And it can be hard to eradicate. So what we're doing is taking stool from healthy people and doing what are called fecal transplants, putting it into other people. So they drink no, they don't drink it. I don't want to give you the wrong. They give you an enema, and it works. It works better than anything else we have. So I think there is something to the hygiene hypothesis. I think there's a lot of work to do on it yet. Okay, what's the next question?
This will be interesting. There's been a lack of research on levels of aluminum absorption into the bloodstream and excretion via urine when injected into infants. Since risk is unknown and combinations of vaccines may contain aluminum in excess of recommended safe levels, would it be wise to use the precautionary principle in vaccinating infants?
It's a great question. Maybe somebody's read some of what I've written because I use this term, the precautionary principle, a lot. Well, in the final analysis, whenever there's a lack of all the data that we would like, you have to say, are we observing issues in children who get vaccines that have, let's just say, component X. Now it's aluminum. A year ago it was thimerosal. The year before that it was gelatin. And we just keep going in things like this. Are we seeing adverse effects? Granted, it can sometimes be hard to see them, but let me give you an example. Denmark did a very interesting experiment. They took a group of kids who had received all of these vaccines, and they looked for things like autoimmune diseases and particularly autism spectrum disorder. And then they took a group of kids where thimerosal and these ingredients were taken out of the vaccines. And they looked at outcomes. No different. No different. So we can't claim cause and effect here. Would we like to have more data? Always. I'm always a fan of more data.
Are people who die from lack of vaccine a part of natural selection?
It's a Darwinian. There's not a politically correct way to answer this question, Jeff. Thanks for the setup. It's a great question. Are there others? People die from lack of vaccine, a part of natural selection. Well, I suppose at the grand scheme, there's a certain aspect of that, isn't there? I don't want to, for the purpose of making a point, I've maybe created or shown you the two ends of the spectrum, and there are, always middle ground. There are certainly people who have contraindications to getting a vaccine, and, I wouldn't like to say, oh, well, you're in the hospital for natural selection. No, I mean, they couldn't get the vaccine. Do I think that in view of the evidence that we have, what we know today, that's the only thing we can operate on, do I think you're being foolish when you reject a vaccine that we have decades of safety data for and decades of benefit? Yes.
Okay. A lot of people who believe that vaccines cause autism feel this way because they have an autistic child who is perfectly healthy before they got the vaccine. What would you say to them?
This is the temporality and causality. One of the behavioral pediatricians at Mayo Clinic did a very interesting study. So I live in a community. Have any of you heard of Lake Wobegon? That's where I live. So it's a town of 100,000 and 40,000 work for Mayo Clinic. So it's a very medically sophisticated group of people. And yet we have residents who come in from Rhode Island and other places, have children, and are there for 3 to 7 years. And so this kind of thing happens. The incidence of autism is pretty high. In males, they're talking about numbers, and I'm not an autism expert, of 1 in 150 to 300, something like that. So he reasoned this. This is a wealthy community. So as these parents would come in, he'd say, do you have a video camera? Oh, yeah, doctor, we do. Well, do you film the child? Oh, yes. Okay. And this is when we were giving the vaccine at the second dose of vaccine around the second and third birthday. And we would typically hear the story, my child was fine until their third birthday when they got the vaccine. And now look at what's happened. He said, bring me the videotapes. So before getting the vaccine, and this was one he shows, at the third birthday party, there's a little boy with a car going like this in the corner. He hasn't gotten his second dose of vaccine, and all the other children are playing over here. Already was demonstrating the stigmata of ASD and hadn't gotten the vaccine. But now there was something that called attention to it. In fact, while we're moving it earlier and earlier, that was the age in which autism was starting to be diagnosed. And so they hooked together the age at which that diagnosis tended to occur and the receipt of vaccine and said X caused Y. There simply is no evidence base for claiming that MMR vaccine causes autism.
Perhaps the last or second to last question. How, if at all, does the national media contribute to the public suspicion of vaccines?
Well, newspapers... How many of you got a vaccine in the last year? Okay. When you got that vaccine, what great things happened? Nothing. And what I mean by that is you didn't get the disease that you got the vaccine for. Nothing happened. But when there's a report about something dramatic, and so your story and my story isn't going to ever be a headline, and it's never going to sell a newspaper. When something dramatic happens, excuse me, like the little girl, well, not so little, 13, who died after getting a dose of HPV vaccine in England, it made the headlines, and they suspended the use of HPV vaccine. until reason prevailed and the autopsy results became available and it was realized she died of her underlying disease. It had nothing to do with HPV vaccine. But it's a powerful story in the media. It catches your attention. You stop what you're doing. If you're preparing dinner and the news is on, and watch it. They're never going to say, Dr. Greg Poland got influenza vaccine and nothing happened. So I think the media are actually part of the culprits here. And less do we actually have scientifically informed, and let me use the pure form of the word, journalists, who actually know the subject matter and report in an informed manner. And I think that's part of the problem.
Well, the final question was, Dr. Poland, what did happen to your hair? But I think we need to, you're not supposed to reveal everything.
It's the anti-vaccine. I pulled it all out.
Let's have a big round of applause for Dr. Poland.
Thank you for being a great audience. I promised Jeff I wasn't going to tell any stories about him.
Well, we do have some very exciting news. Again, the alumni panel is on next week. But on November 8th, we have some very exciting news. Dr. Paul Farmer, the book Mountains Beyond Mountains is about Paul Farmer, is going to come and speak as part of the colloquium on November 8th, right here, 7:30 p.m. So very exciting. Please come out. He'll come to class, students, so that's very exciting. Have a good night. Be safe. Get vaccinated.